All right, so this is called Focus, Sharpen Your Skills, and I want to talk about 4 different focusing techniques and tools that we have for improving focus. And so we're going to talk about these 4 different areas. Let's go ahead and start off with what I like to call intelligent focus. Now, this doesn't really have a well-accepted name in the industry right now. And this is, it's focus tracking, subject tracking. There's a lot of different tracking options that have come around. And a lot of it is due to the mirrorless cameras that we're using. So with intelligent focus, as I like to call it, it's basically a program that identifies what you want in focus and tracks it throughout the frame. And this goes by names that you might see in your various camera brands as subject tracking, face tracking, and eye tracking. Now, the reason this has come about with mirrorless cameras rather than SLRs, well, let's take a look at how SLR cameras work. We have light coming through a lens, got our aperture and all of that good stuff in there. Now, an SLR reflex stands for mirror, so that means the light's getting bounced upwards so that you can see through it. And a little bit of the light is bounced downwards through the mirror into an autofocus sensor. Now, the autofocus sensors that we've had in our cameras for the last 30 years have been rather rudimentary, you might say. They're very simplistic. They can tell if things are far away or close up, and that's about it. That's all they can do. Now, with a mirrorless camera, we have all this light coming in through the lens, and it's going straight to this image sensor. And the image sensor, well, these days they're anywhere between 20 and 60 megapixels, which means they are gathering a lot of information. And with the increased processing power in the cameras, there's a lot that the camera can figure out about what you are trying to shoot and what's going on and how it's moving around. Now, in the DSLR, yes, you can put your camera into live view. You do lose the view through the viewfinder, which is a really important part about the whole process. And there are many DSLRs that will give you subject tracking and an intelligent focus when you're in the live view mode, but sometimes they're more difficult to handhold and track action in that regard. And so they can do it, they're just not as good as the mirrorless cameras in a very general sense. All right, so the idea starting big is with subject tracking, which is anything you want. It can be any shape, any object you want, you should be able to track it. When you put your camera into a tracking mode, it's usually going to give you some target, some box, and you would place that box over your particular subject. It might pop up with a frame, and as you move that subject around the frame, it's going to try to follow it. Now, if you move too quickly, it may not be able to follow it absolutely precisely. This is still a technology in its infancy, and they've made great strides in the last few years, but it just seems to be getting better and better with each new generation of camera. And so the idea on this is that you can have a subject that's randomly moving around, and the camera is going to be tracking where that is and adjusting for it in real time. And the beauty is that you're going to be able to get lots of photos that are perfectly in focus with subjects that are very difficult to normally track in many cases. Now, the tracking ability is going to vary a little bit on the actual subject speed, both the lateral speed, side to side, and this would kind of be compounded with you panning, moving the camera from side to side, as well as its forward motion. How big is it in the frame? Very small objects like a bird at a far distance is going to be very hard to track. There's not as much information for it to go on. Background separation is the focus difference between your subject and the background. If you have a small bird with kind of mixed colors on a mixed background very close to it, it's going to be hard to identify that one particular subject because it doesn't really stand out from the background. Any sort of interference is an object that comes between you and your subject. And so if there's a referee that comes between you and the player that you're tracking, that can throw things off. It could be the trunk of a tree as you're panning from side to side. And so all of these are variables along with the camera you use and the firmware that is being run on it at this given moment as to how good your camera is going to do on this. There's been a number of cameras that have had firmware updates that have improved the focus tracking ability. So make sure your cameras have the latest firmware if you want to get the latest, greatest performance from your particular camera. Now, the available tracking subjects that I have seen various cameras claim to be able to follow is the list you see on screen here. And this is likely to grow exponentially in the next several years as they can identify more unique and particular subjects. There's a number of cameras that just have a general subject, which it'll do anything, but the ones that it particularly identifies a subject, they understand the shape and the look of that particular subject, and they're likely to do a little better job at tracking that subject if you can individually identify it. Now, some tips on doing this is if you are trying to capture in-focus pictures of moving subjects, you should probably have your camera in the continuous autofocus mode. And there's a variety of names like AFC, CAF, or servo that you need to have your camera in. And this is for tracking your subject forward and back. It's tracking their motion. This is what autofocus cameras have had for more than 30 years. You need to be able to separate your subject from the background. And this is going to be easier to do with a long lens, with a wider aperture, with a greater focus separation between your subject and the background. The more separation you have, the easier your subject's going to stand out, the easier your camera is going to be able to follow that subject around the frame. And then stabilization. A lot of cameras and lenses have stabilization, and that's just going to keep the framing of your subject a little bit more even and smooth, and it's going to make it a little bit easier to follow. A very long lens with no stabilization might kind of be jittery and moving around quite a bit, and it's not going to be able to track quite as well in that regard. And finally, you just need to get to learn your camera systems. We could talk all day about Sony or Canon or Nikon or Fuji or anyone else, but they all work a little bit differently, and the way that you use them is going to be a little bit different. So I'm not able to go into that here, but it's something, a homework assignment for you, you might say. Now, face tracking is just a little bit more specific version of this subject tracking that does look for faces. And this can either be the greatest feature you've ever used or the worst feature you've ever used. That's my experience with it, is it can both be great and bad. Where it is great is in a situation like you're seeing here, where there's an individual subject that's clearly standing out from any other faces or objects in the frame. It's very easy for it to grab onto. Sometimes when you have multiple faces, it can be challenging because the camera doesn't know which face you want to focus on. It will typically go on the one that seems the most dominant or maybe is the largest. And on some cameras, they allow you to very quickly change from one face to another face using one of the touch controls on the back of the camera or somewhere else on the camera. So that's a good feature that you should investigate and know about how to use if you are working with multiple people. One of the fun and interesting ones, I think, is on Sony cameras. They have a face registration. And the way that I've always imagined this is that you as the parent of, well, I guess in this case, 8 small children, and you want to put them into your camera database so that your camera recognizes those faces and will prioritize those faces. So when they get up on the stage play and there's all these kids up on stage, your camera knows to focus on your child. Now, of course, as you see the numbers 1 through 8, you can see the dilemma if you have more than one child is you need to prioritize your children, which I'm sure many parents do already, but that is something I will let you do on your own. And so you can register your faces in there, adjust their priority, and then it will focus on the faces higher up on that priority scale. Now, if you want to narrow in a little bit further, you can go to eye tracking. And this is obviously where it looks at the eye. There has been some problems with some cameras going more on the eyelash than the eye, and that's how exacting we're getting here, folks. So you do need to be very precise about where you get this set. Now, as far as the eye tracking, most of the cameras these days, the modern ones, are doing a very, very good job. They do have some options in the menus that you can go for instance, eye auto, where it chooses the nearest eye to you, right eye and left eye options. Now, interestingly, because I do work with a lot of cameras, not all the brands are consistent in what they think the right eye is. Sometimes it's the right eye that you see as the photographer. In other cases, it's the right eye of the person that you are taking the photograph of. And so just be aware of how your camera picks left eye and right eye. And sometimes they'll just have a nearest eye, which is probably the one that I would choose, because that's usually one that you want as the one that is most in focus in a portrait. And so if you don't want that, well, then you need to make a small adjustment with that. So that is our focus tracking. Now be aware that most of this focus tracking that I've been talking about, whether it's with the face or the eye, is generally referring to tracking the subject around the frame, left, right, and up and down, and doesn't necessarily mean tracking it forward and back. And so that's where you need to have the focusing, that continuous focusing turned on. Now, how well your camera tracks the subject left, right, and up and down is really going to depend on your camera and the firmware running it. How good is it being able to pick out a subject? As far as the focusing of your subject, how quickly can your camera keep up with things? Well, that's going to be controlled by your camera, what lens you have on it, and the focusing system within that lens, as well as the firmware that's running all of that operation on there. And so there's a number of things that could go wrong and a number of reasons why that could be that way. So be aware that there are several different places to look to try to look for where is the problem, and then trying to address, okay, well, how do I fix that particular problem? Okay, so Vicki, that's my last slide for this first part, intelligent focus. So maybe we'll take a look and see if there's any questions people have. They can, I think, put them into the comments or raise their hand, but I'll let you pop in and address that.
Well, I saw a few of them coming up, and I think Michelle was going to choose some for us. Are you there, Michelle?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, everyone. Forgive me if I'm getting any of the names pronunciation a bit incorrect, but Kathy Lichtendahl, I think it is, had a question. There's two questions, and both of them relate to tracking. So the first one is, do you have to keep the AF button depressed to keep focus tracking active?
This may be camera dependent. In many cases, no, it will track the subject even with no fingers on the camera. Now, to actually focus on that subject, you will, in most every case, need to press the button down. I believe there are some cases where you can put cameras into always autofocusing, which I usually don't recommend. And so you could have a subject identified, it's following it around the frame, but it's not actually focusing on it generally until you press either your shutter release button or the AF on button on the back of the camera, depending on how you have your camera set up.
Okay, and the second question was from Cynthia, and I believe it's been answered, but if you can clarify this, will tracking work for left to right movement as well as forward and back?
Yes, tracking is mainly left, right, up and down within the frame.
That's all of the questions, I think, for the time being.
Michelle, a couple people had raised their hand. I saw.
So just a quick question, Johnny. Let's say you are taking a picture of a couple, and you want to do the tracking with continuous focus. Would you recommend in that scenario using zone, or what would you recommend in that scenario?
With a couple, it'd be a little bit tricky, because if it is picking one of their faces and one of them is a little bit closer, that could cause a problem with that other person being out of focus. And so I would probably direct them to try to stay even to the camera, depending on what aperture you're shooting at. I'm still getting used to this new focus tracking. I love technology, but I'm still kind of old school in a lot of things that I do. And I would probably be just choosing a wider focusing bracket that kind of hit their torsos overall and their faces, depending on how they're positioned and so forth. Because with two people, I suppose, you take the bride and make sure that it's on her. There are two different options. You can try both. I can't tell you off the bat which one is best for you, but I think one of those two options should serve your needs quite well.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
John, just one more question from Dylan. Is tracking on all DSLR cameras or only the higher end models?
The tracking on the DSLRs generally are on later end models of the last, say, 5 years, and it's really only in live view that they work. Now, the catch-22 is that while DSLRs can track in live view, they are terrible in general at focusing in live view. So it's just something that doesn't work real well for fast-moving subjects with DSLRs. If it's a slower moving subject, like someone walking pretty slowly, it'll be okay. But for sports photography, it just doesn't work with DSLRs. And there's a little asterisk right up here. The Nikon D5, D6, Canon 1DX models, they're kind of in a separate category. That autofocus module at the bottom of the mirror housing in the DSLRs are of a very another higher level than most of the DSLRs out there. And so those are, $6,000 cameras, and they had some more intelligent focusing, but they were not giving us as photographers great feedback. It was all kind of in the mojo, buried in the algorithm, and it was doing a good job to help it focus, and which is why those cameras were so popular with sports photographers, is that they were the best at the time. And now when it comes to tracking sports, mirrorless has truly fully taken over in the last year or so from DSLRs as being the kings and the best of it.
Another question, more with accessories, not the camera itself. Do any filters adversely affect the function of the systems?
Well, anything that affects the light coming in the camera might adversely affect it. Anything that restricts the amount of light, a neutral density filter, a polarizing filter. I don't think that it's going to harm it a lot, but it might take the performance down by 10 or 20% because it's taking the light level down by 10 or 20%. I've not done any testing, but this is just kind of intuitively what makes sense to me. I think it's generally going to work though.